it says at the top what had the date. So March the 12th would make that easy to spot. We're going to finish up last week's and hopefully get into the text this week, 28 to 38. We'll see how that goes as far as time. I don't think we had too much left to discuss in verses 12 to 27. We'd gotten a fair bit of progress there, and just kind of recap while you're getting your outline and got your Bible open at John 18. We had seen in chapter 18, verse 1, the seizing of Jesus in the garden. So they'd gone to Gethsemane, and does anybody remember about how many came out in that group to bind him and to arrest him? Yeah, there was probably about 1,000 men, right? I've lost my water. Let me see if I left it. So we had about 1,000 men, and what happened? What happened when they came to arrest him? What? Uh-oh. I thought you were going to go handle that, Bill. Typical dad move. Dad just shuts the door. So 1,000 men come. Jesus says, whom do you seek? And of course, they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And he says, ego eimi. And 1,000 men, many of whom are hardened Roman soldiers, collapse to the ground, right? Peter gets a little bold and rushes into the crowd with a short sword and takes the ear of Malchus, the high priest's slave. And of course, Jesus does another miracle. He actually restores, Malchus's ear. But in and amongst all that, there's still no recognition, ultimately, by all those that had come to arrest him, that he is truly the Son of God. He is who he claimed to be. He's God in human flesh. Because who else speaking the word, I am, and everyone falls to the ground, who can restore someone's ear that has been severed? This is truly God, but they're unfazed. So they take him, and who did they take him to first? Do we remember where they took him first? By the way, when did this happen? Setting the scene again. When did this happen? Yeah, it was Thursday night into Friday morning. So this is all happening at night. Okay, so this is again, several reasons for that. Probably one, they knew how popular Jesus was, and they would certainly not wanted to do this during the daytime with crowds gathered, and that would have been a very difficult thing to do. So they've gone out onto the Mount of Olives. It's dark, although there would have been a full moon, but it's night, and they've arrested him. Where did they take him first? Do we remember? To see Annas, right? Who was the high priest who had been appointed for life, but remember the Romans were deposing them so that there wasn't one person holding that office, in perpetuity. And so his son-in-law was the acting high priest. And who was his son-in-law? Caiaphas, right? So Caiaphas actually had the authority, although Annas still kind of holds the position, the title, the prestige. I mean, because Numbers 35:25 tells us that high priests were appointed for life. And so he would have been the high priest. And they took him to Annas. So if you're looking at your outline, this would be probably on the back of last week's Roman numeral 4. So they bound him. They took him to Annas. And then, of course, Annas is going to send him to Caiaphas, because Caiaphas would have to be the one that would actually pass like a judgment as the acting high priest. We also noted that he was one of the longest serving high priests during the first century. And then it flips over to Peter. So they've bound Jesus, they've taken him to Annas, who's going to ultimately send him to Caiaphas. And then we see Peter, who, remember when Christ was arrested, the disciples had dispersed, right? So they had fled, but we know that there's Peter and another disciple. And who do we believe that disciple to be? John. I'll give you a few little evidences for that and why I thought that to be the case. And so John has gotten them admission into the high priest's courtyard where they've taken Jesus, and Peter goes with him. And I think we left off probably somewhere in that neighborhood. So let's pick up in maybe chapter 18, verse 15. And then or did we get further than that? Did somebody have any notes? And did we get down to like 0.6, or were we in 0.5? Does that sound about right? I didn't do a very good job of marking that last week. Sorry. We'll pick up in verse 15. So Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who we believe was John, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. And so if you think about the situation here, John has been admitted. He knows the high priest. He's probably I think the thing that's most plausible is that his father being a fisherman, being one who would have sold fish to many of the, households and the elites of Judea. I mean, John probably had a relationship as someone who had done business, with the high priest or his family. So John knows this. He knows the high priest. He gets admittance into the area. Peter is with him, and John basically tells the girl at the door, "Hey, this guy's with me." And yet, when this servant girl, I actually did talk about this last week. Now it's coming back to me. So this servant girl is questioning him. "Are you not one of his disciples?" Now here's the girl at the door, right? And when is there any threat that she hold any power, any authority over Peter? Is there anything this girl at the door can do to Peter? None. And he's already seen John has gone in. So John's there. John's alive. All his arms and legs are still attached. Like there's John. And this girl asked him, "Are you one of his disciples?" And what does he say? "I am not." So he wants to be near Christ, and he wants to be there. He loves the Lord. And yet here he is in this moment with this little girl. And he's, "I don't know him. I don't know him. I don't know who that guy is. I'm just a bystander, at 2:00 in the morning, in the middle of the night, running around, the high priest's courtyard, but I don't know this Jesus," right? But of course we know that ultimately, what did Jesus foretold hours before? He would deny him 3 times before the rooster crowed. So
I don't know about you all, but when I get in an unknown situation that could be threatening, my brain goes into utter confusion, and I can't think straight. So I can see all of this, he doesn't have a clue what's happening. This is a left turn from everything that he thought was happening, and you're suddenly in the enemy's territory, and you're asked a question, and I would just think his brain was not even functioning.
Just survival mode, yeah.
Yeah, and you're just your eyes are big, and you're just trying to understand what in the world is happening.
Yeah, no doubt. And the thing that we take away from this, I'm going to read Sproul's quote at the end of this outline. But I mean, aren't we the same way? Are we any different than Peter? Aren't there many moments where we just absolutely cower in fear, and because of whether it's the fear of rejection of men or whatever the case may be, we do the exact same thing. Yeah. And I think there's got to be, like, to your point about just his brain, where his mind was, like, let's figure it's an hour ago. An hour ago, he's taken a short sword and charged a crowd. But that was before what had happened. Jesus wasn't bound. So Jesus is standing there, and all these thousands of men have just fallen like dominoes. And so he rushes with the short sword into the crowd. But then what happens to Jesus? He allows himself to be bound and taken. And so that in and of itself probably had some impact on, because you got to think, he knows Jesus is God in human flesh. He's seen everything that he had done for those 3+ years, and now he sees him bound and standing before these. So that's got to have an impact for sure. Yeah.
What is he supposed to do? And I'm sure even if he stand at the gate, there were probably officers right around there. So his response was to a girl, but likely she wasn't just the only,
Sure.
Next thing you know, someone's going to overhear this.
And that kind of comes up at the third denial when they recognize that he's the one that cut Malchus's ear. Yeah, I think it escalates in terms of his perception of what may happen to him as these 3 events take place. All right, so let's look at any other thoughts on Peter? We'll come back, and it kind of flips back to Peter. So it's going to flip back to Jesus in front of the high priest, and then at the end, 25 to 28, it'll flip back to Peter for the second and the third denial. So verse 19, the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. real quick point on that. That's absolutely against the Jewish legal tradition. Like you weren't to question the actual the accused. And a couple of things here. Number one, there's actually not been a crime or a charge laid against Jesus. So there's no formal indictment. Like that's the first thing. The second thing is that he's not required to testify against himself. Much like we talk about pleading the fifth, in our U.S. Constitution, the idea that you have to lay forth the evidence, bring the evidence. We have an adversarial system of justice where we weigh the evidence, and then of course a decision is rendered. But this is absolutely antithetical to what Jewish legal custom would be. You don't just demand of the person like the high priest is doing here. Jesus answered him, "I've spoken openly to the world." In other words, what he's saying there is there should be thousands of witnesses. Okay, so if you want to bring a witness, you should be able to find one anywhere, because where have I spoken? Publicly. I've spoken publicly. I've taught openly. So there should be no shortage of, if you want to bring someone in to testify either for or against me, there is no shortage in Judea or even in Galilee. I spoke everywhere openly. So there's absolutely no shortage of witnesses. I've always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? In other words, what he's saying is you're not following protocol. You're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. This is not how this is supposed to be handled. That's why he says, why do you question me? Or why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said. Do this the right way. Call witnesses against me. Like, you're not doing this right. What he's doing is he's exposing them. He's exposing that this is a mockery of justice because they're not following their own legal tradition. When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered him, "If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me?" See, what he is absolutely exposing them, and like so often happens when the truth is just so obvious and undeniable, what do people tend to do? They get angry. And so this guy smacks Jesus because he's speaking absolute truth, because he's exposing that they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. This is not a legal arraignment. This is not legal. It's in the middle of the night. There's no formal indictment, and they're questioning him. They're questioning the accused. None of that is legal. And he's saying, if I've missed, but you strike me, why do you strike me? I'm speaking absolute truth. I'm exposing this, and yet you hit me. What have I said? What have I just said that's not truthful or not accurate? And of course, the answer to that's nothing. He's speaking the absolute truth to them, and so he smacks him in anger. Okay. Any thoughts on any of that? Was fairly straightforward, but just wanted to point out the hypocrisy in they can't even follow their own rules. They're inventing this as they go, because this isn't a trial. This is a murder, right? This is not a trial. What they're doing to Jesus is they're executing a plan to murder someone, right? Go back to when we looked at John 11. Flip back to John 11. This is Caiaphas 11. I think it's 53, maybe 47. 47, I guess. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, "What are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish." And of course, that winds up being very prophetic, because that's, even though Caiaphas doesn't intend to be discussing the substitutionary atonement, that's exactly what he's prophesying there. But what he's saying is, better that this man, we need to get rid of this man so that the Romans don't come against us or think that he's some type of insurrectionist, which is kind of interesting, because we're going to look at today. That's the charge they ultimately want to lay against him, is that they want Pilate to execute him as an insurrectionist. And we'll look at that here in just a moment. Okay. So this is the plan. This is the murder of Christ. They don't care. They're not worried about justice, because justice cannot be served when you have a sinless, when you have the one who is accused is sinless. There can be no justice, right? So this is a murder that they've hatched, and they're trying to execute in the middle of the night. All right, last point here on last week's text through 28. Peter denying Jesus again. So verse 25. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, you also are not one of his disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, did I not see you in the garden with him? Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. And so we see he was given an opportunity to redeem himself from an earlier denial. So it's kind of the boost point. Let's say he's in that just frazzled state. He's very, emotional. He's distraught of what all these events that have taken place. But now he's over there by the fire and he's warming himself. Maybe his nerves have calmed a little bit. I don't know.